Thank you everybody for joining us today, our panelists and our live audience included. We're super excited to be having this conversation. Today's event is titled Pride and Protest, Free Expression and LGBTQIA Student Activism in 2020. This is the 11th in Pan America's online forum series, which has been headed by our campus free speech program called Free Speech in the Virtual Campus. Today, in the spirit of Pride, Pan America is joined by an esteemed panel of 5 students and recent graduates who have been active in the LGBTQIA advocacy space to discuss today queer student identities, free expression, and the impacts of COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement on these identities and on the queer advocacy spaces for students at colleges and universities across the country. Joining us today, we have Brianna Brown, Vice President of the Black Graduate Student Organization at Carnegie Mellon University, Ravana Kintral, a human rights undergraduate student at Columbia University and a current immigration intern and paralegal at the Migration Resource Center. We have Carolyn Gassert, Vice President of Understanding Sexuality, Gender, and Allyship from Brigham Young University. We have Alex Steedman, MS Master Social Work, youth worker and empathetic rebel rouser from the University of Washington. We have Gary Robert Wilkins Jr., computational biology PhD candidate and Vice President of Finance of the Graduate Student Assembly at Carnegie Mellon University. And I hope everyone will join me in welcoming these panelists. I'm super excited to start this conversation and very privileged. My name is Nico, and I am the program coordinator for Campus Free Speech here at Pan America. I will be serving as the moderator, queuing up the questions between everyone and helping to facilitate the conversation for all of the panelists joining us today. So the format of today's session is going to include, we're going to start off with a roundtable of some introductory questions for each of the panelists, followed by some more general questions open to any of the panelists to answer and respond to. And we'll also be entertaining questions from Zoom's Q&A function. So for our live audience, please feel free to submit questions into the Q&A and we can entertain them as the conversation progresses. And lastly, I just want to encourage our panelists to embrace this roundtable and the conversation openly and be reminded that you are encouraged to react and respond to each other conversationally as you feel compelled. This is an open forum and we would like you to feel open to responding and adding to statements made by your peers. So without further ado, I want to launch us into our initial roundtable, which is going to be the introductory questions for everybody. I think it'll be a good chance to get to know everybody's experiences firsthand beyond just the title introduction that I've started us off with today. So first, we're going to go to Brianna. You are first up. And so, Brianna, I want to talk about and hear from you about how the Black Lives Matter movement has really attracted a lot of young people and students to these protests that have been taking place across the country for the past several weeks, including many from the LGBTIQ and queer community. Many have also particularly been enraged by the alarming number of Black trans people who have been murdered this year, and that's taken up a lot of, that's been one of the prominent issues that we've been seeing being brought up in these protests. And so I want to ask kind of a broader question here: what role you believe Black queer youth and students especially have within the Black Lives Matter movement at this time?
Okay, can you all hear me? Just making sure, double checking. All right, good. So, well, first I want to look at the historical context of Black activism. If you look back, a lot of times within the Black community, especially in America, we were mainly organized by the church, and we've mainly organized things through the church and did a lot of things through church-like institutions, and this has unfortunately led to a lot of homophobia and a lot of ideals that are unfortunately against LGBTQ people within the Black community. It's not everybody, of course, but especially in the older generations, there's a huge push against Black queer youth. So I believe that today, as Black queer students who are engaging in activism, we need to make more space for Black queer youth within the Black Lives Matter movement to make sure that they feel safe, to make sure that they feel nurtured, to make sure that they feel cared for within our groups, because Black queer lives matter. We know that Black lives matter, of course, but we need to also focus on the Black queer lives because they are a minority group within a minority group that is definitely prosecuted a little bit more than just cisgendered, normal, cisgendered people within the Black community.
Thank you, Brianna. And I should have, I apologize, I should have also asked for everybody to also start with their pronouns as well. Just mine are he, him, and his. And Brianna?
I am she, her, hers.
Thank you so much, Brianna. A lot of really good points here. Let's add more into this initial roundtable of perspectives. We're going to go to Ray or Ravana now. And Ray, taking into account your experience working as an immigration paralegal and your studies in the human rights realm, 2 weeks ago, we saw that the Supreme Court blocked Trump's attempt to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA. And although this was viewed as an important victory for immigrant rights, many queer and undocumented students still face challenges navigating both the closets of sexuality expression as well as their immigration status. What do those challenges look like, Ray, for this niche community, and how has the COVID-19 pandemic further complicated or impacted those situations? And also a reminder for pronouns as well.
So my pronouns are she, her, hers. I think during COVID, a big thing that we're seeing within the undocumented queer community is a reshuffling of resources. So where these students might have had resources on campus, access to healthcare, which includes mental health, trans affirming, hormone therapy, things of that nature, they may not be able to access it as well back at home, and it may not be as safe for them to either. So I think that's one thing that COVID has really shook up for that. We also are seeing this like fear of coming out of the closet, which can also be coupled with this fear of sort of coming out as undocumented. So sort of what we were talking about is like this double closet sort of idea. And I think that these two intersections can be really dangerous for people because they can face higher levels of homelessness, higher levels of assault, like you were talking about, Brianna, like Black trans women and things like that. And so I think people that are undocumented and queer live at a kind of dangerous intersection sometimes. So I'm glad that we're having this discussion today.
Thank you so much, Brianna. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Ray. We're going to move on to our next panelist, Carolyn. So for many queer students, faith can, we've already been hearing how race and immigration status are, kind of some of the layers that we think of when we think of free expression and queer identities, and that a lot of students have to process and think about how to navigate their lives. For many queer students, in your view, or kind of zooming out for a second, for many queer students, faith can also be a complicating factor when determining how to balance self-expression with religious tradition. And so, Carolyn, what do you think some of the biggest obstacles are for queer students engaging with religious groups on campus? And how could religiously affiliated universities, for example, be more inclusive of LGBTIQ student organizations?
So my pronouns are she, her, hers. And going with that question, I think kind of touching on, Brianna kind of touched on this a little bit, talking about, how a lot of the time in the older generations with religious traditions, there is like a pushback towards not only LGBTQ people within their religion, but also other minorities, racial minorities, gender minorities. And I think probably the biggest, or one of the biggest obstacles that queer students face at religious institutions such as Brigham Young University, where I attend, is the intense othering that tends to happen. There's a lot of us versus them kind of mentality, and kind of this belief that queer people can't be religious, or queer people should not be religious if they are wanting to also identify with their queer identity. There's a lot of push to forsake that queer identity if you want to be involved in religious institutions, especially conservative religious institutions. Um, and I think a way that religiously affiliated universities could be more inclusive of their LGBTQ students is by kind of getting to the root of what I believe religion should be. And that's the radical inclusive love that I think should exist in religious spaces, but unfortunately is often seen as a deviancy from those religious traditions.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We're already getting so many varied perspectives here before we launch into the general questions. I would like to turn now to Alex. The COVID-19 pandemic has closed down campuses, sending many students home to unsafe family environments where LGBTIQ students cannot freely express themselves. Furthermore, access to queer student groups and mental and sexual health services on campus have also become closed off, essentially, when the students went home. And there's the added layer of a lot of the homes, that students return to, a lot of the communities that students return to, psychological and sexual health services have kind of shuttered, their doors to in-person visits. And so it's been difficult for a lot of students to access, help with mental health and any other, health needs that they may have. And so I want to give you an opportunity here to break down for us kind of the anticipated effects of the pandemic and ongoing civil unrest, just basically 2020 in general, what effect that's having on queer student wellness, and adding that, that extra thought of, how this is affecting their, their self-expression, their freedom to express themselves.
Yeah, there's just a lot of layers to that question. So he, him, his is my pronouns. But where to start with that? So just on a very basic level, we know about minority stress, right? So anyone who has identity that is not in the dominant group or the group that's in power often feels some sort of minority stress because they walk around with these either visible or invisible identities that put a target on their back sometimes, or disenfranchise them, or institutionalized racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever it may be. So that's like the baseline like mental health deficit for LGBTQ people, and then you add the layers if they're a person of color or more so than that. So we're already working with that deficit, unfortunately, and it's really difficult, because as some other members have stated, that a lot of services on campuses are free, they're accessible, their mental health and physical health. I know that was what I was using all the time when I was in undergrad specifically. So to return home, it can be a real shock, can be a real, and like the phrase is it's just a shock to the system, returning home, because oftentimes there's this incongruence with who you are becoming or already am in college, right? And then oftentimes when you return home, there's this feeling of reverting to an older self, right? There's a feeling of like, this is who I was in that context. And there's incongruence where like, that is actually not who you are anymore. I had that experience so I grew up in rural Montana, and then I went to New York University. So I lived in New York City for a number of years. And then after my time there, I moved back to not my hometown, but like a city nearby where I grew up. And I had to really come to terms with who am I in this space. And actually it was very empowering because I got to reclaim my history, right? I got to reclaim this territory that was once very disempowering to myself. To be like, I was this like disempowered, very sad, very depressed, young, newly out young boy in small town Montana. And now I'm coming back like this man who knows himself much more, who is able to stand up for himself more. So it's able to like kind of go full circle in that way. So while there's a huge learning curve and deficit to returning to these places, I also want to like frame it as a possibility to just sort of reclaim that that space, because it all has to do with perspective, right? It has to do with how we're entering those things. Because if you truly are going in thinking, being fearful, not to say that there isn't valid fear, of course, but if you go in with that perspective, that's probably what the result is going to be, right? We're initiating that from within inside ourselves. And the second point I want to make is COVID has changed the game for healthcare, period. We are really, we were already inching towards more telehealth, but now we've like gone full speed ahead, right? So we have therapy that's telehealth, we have doctor's appointments. So the accessibility is hopefully getting better, even in rural places, right? I know that for a lot of people who are in rural spots, there isn't always great mental health care nearby or locally, especially for LGBTQ people or inclusive mental health care, period. But I'm hoping that as we are doing more telehealth, we can actually see providers from other parts of the state you're in, perhaps, and in bigger cities. So I just hope that the accessibility is more out there. I know there's a provider in Washington State who is a trans affirming healthcare provider, and they don't have a physical office. They purely function online. And so that's how they do all their client work. So I think that's where we're heading towards, but I'm sure each state is very different in where they are in that process. I would just encourage you to seek out what's available. And unfortunately, we really have to advocate for ourselves, because a lot of times no one knows what's best for us except for us. And so we have to be that voice, and we have to speak up about what our needs are. But then again, there's that balance of like, is it safe? Is it safe to do that? So there's no right answer, but I'm just like throwing all these things out there to consider as you are processing your journey back to the place that you grew up, whether you call it home or not.
And I think we also have a question here kind of for a more kind of general set of just kind of, the effects of engaging with student groups virtually. And I think we can also talk about telehealth kind of within that sphere as well. Before we get into the general question, of course, Gary, kind of rounding out the roundtable, helping us kind of finish this introductory set here. Many in the queer community talk a lot about intersectionality, this kind of layering of multiple identities, or this kind of applying multiple layers to identity to analyze an individual's and assess kind of an individual's or present an individual's experience. When we think about the intersection of race and sexuality, for example, we often consider how the social composition of a community or geographic region can directly impact the individual's ability to freely express their identity. And so the question for you, Gary, is how you believe that this plays out for individuals embracing both their Blackness and queerness in academic spaces.
So first off, my internet connection's naturally unstable. So if any of you can't hear me, can someone just message me on chat so I can know where to come back? So on the subject of intersectionality, I think it'd be really useful to just take a bit of a review, just real quickly. So this is a really quintessential concept in critical race theory, but a lot of people forget that it actually started out as a legal concept by an attorney named Kimberly Crenshaw. This is about 30 years ago, and at the time is fairly obscure. I think it was first published, the idea was first published in a Chicago paper, journal. And the idea is basically concerning how race, class, gender, and various other identities intersect and overlap, and how each of those is used usually negatively in a differential way to subject a particular individual to certain types of biases and how that contributes to their collective experience. So there's a dynamic here because your community from one place in the country, say for example, if, as Alex was saying earlier, if you're talking about rural Montana or Utah or the Bible Belt or somewhere in the Northeast, those experiences can change because your communities will change and those compositions are different. So for example, if you are in the Bible Belt as a Black queer person, on that, sorry, he, his, him, if you are a Black queer person in the Bible Belt, you may very well be embraced in your community. Think of, for example, Atlanta, very usually speaking Black positive or yeah, Black positive. But depending on your community and the makeup of that community, particularly if it's a religious community, sometimes it's not terribly uncommon to encounter a fair amount of prejudice as a consequence of being queer. So you are differentially embraced there. If you are in an academic space, this is certainly not the experience of all people who are of the queer community, but it's more often or more likely to be the case that you may be embraced to a completely normal extent as a result of being in the queer community, whereas if you are Black, Indigenous, or just generally a person of color, that experience may differ. So that's really the point of, that's really, I guess, the point of intersectionality there. It provides us, I think, with a lens through which we can understand one another, and also gives us, I think, good cause to come together in kind of a solidarity, because we may all experience different types of prejudices or biases that may impact us in different communities. So it's for our collective benefit to join together to fight those kinds of forces.
And could you elaborate just a little bit, Gary, on how you think this kind of plays out in academic spaces, or perhaps in your experience working with students on campus?
Certainly. So this is certainly like my personal experience, but I also believe there's fairly good evidence for this. A lot of queer people over the past, I would say, several decades have been attracted to academia because it's been perceived, for better or worse, as a welcoming environment, as a maybe more tolerant environment for people who are queer representing. However, I think there's plenty of studies and evidence to suggest, not studies, and simply just walk down your the closest department you have and look for how many people of color, Black or Indigenous, Native Americans there are, and what you'll find is, frankly, a dearth of representation. What that means in real terms is that your queerness, if you will, is not going to necessarily be as much of an issue in certain environments, certainly, as, for example, being Black or Indigenous, how seriously you're taken, the amount of effort that it takes to secure tenure, the amount of effort it takes to secure a spot to get into graduate school in the first place. That experience may be very different when contrasted with, say, how being queer and how being openly queer contributes to your success in these spaces. And this gets back again to the original idea of intersectionality, because there is a differential there as to what part of your identity is embraced. I think for me, I was a math major, I like to think of it as kind of a vector field. How, like, what the slope is depends on where you are in the field. And it also depends on what identities, what communities you belong to, what communities you have some ownership of, as well as what environments you find yourself either working in or playing a part of.
Thank you, Gary. I want to kind of take this conversation now into a broader, open this more broadly to the panel to kind of start our general conversation here. Kind of continuing that thought on just like, the experiences of queer students on campus. And I know, Gary, you were saying a lot of people are coming to these campuses. A lot of queer people come to campuses expecting it to be a welcoming and inviting environment, but not everyone experiences it this way, right? And so I think I want to hear from everyone's kind of advocacy experience with student organizations on campus. When you were a part of student organizations in the past, groups that you're a part of now, what have those advocacy initiatives looked like? What are you fighting for or moving or trying to move forward on campuses? And this is free for anybody to jump in here.
I can talk a little bit to that. I have a couple different experiences within the queer advocacy role in schools. I'm a community college graduate as well. I can talk a little bit about my experience there. I think in community colleges, they lack a lot of the resources that you might have at larger four-year universities. So even getting access to healthcare is really hard for students. Getting access to mental health, they don't have all of these accesses on campus. So I think a big thing is connecting students to bigger resources in the community, which these smaller two-year universities or smaller two-year colleges don't have. I think that's a big one. And the second thing that I really worked on is the policies within school. So one of the policies that I mainly worked on was gaining access to gender neutral restrooms, because it was almost impossible when I first started my club to find gender neutral restrooms. They were reserved for the staff. And so I had a couple people coming to me and they couldn't even have their most basic needs met. So that was something we worked on a lot. So I think I think training is a big one, and connecting people to the resources outside of university to make their university life even easier. Those are the two things that I really have seen.
Has this looked similar to any of our other panelists, or have there been any other kind of additional things that you've been fighting for on campuses or trying to get changed?
In my experience, one thing that has been at the forefront of like our efforts both at CMU as well as my alma mater, UNC Chapel Hill, has been trying to push for more inclusivity. So a really obvious and worthwhile example of that would be advocacy for gender neutral bathrooms. But maybe a more sharp example could also be, I forget when this movement came about. It was championed by a number of people like Dan Savage, a journalist out of Seattle, Washington. It Gets Better, that campaign, and it was, like so many campaigns, very well intentioned. But for the most part, it did seem to feature predominantly white men expressing how things really did get better for them, while leaving out a lot of people for whom things did not get better because they didn't have this experience of course, moving throughout the world as a white man, a cisgender white man, nor did they have the experience, and this gets to class, of being able to go to university and, being able to maybe move away from a family that's less than supportive, being able to create a support network, which is essential, I think, in any space, whether you are a budding young adult in college or an old 30-year-old like myself. It's so a lot of the efforts that I've seen, both firsthand and that I've read about, have been towards pushing towards greater inclusivity, because what we're understanding to an even greater extent is how richly diverse and varied the LGBTIQ, the queer community generally is. And it spans the gamut of cis to transgender to multiple races, ethnic groups, immigration statuses, and of course, kind of harkening back to the idea of intersectionality, kind of this wide swath of potential forces working against them systemically.
So I have the unique experience of going to two very large and two very two universities that pride themselves in how progressive they think they are, NYU and University of Washington. And the first thing I'll say is just, while I had great experiences at both, I also just, I'm someone who always is wanting to do better, be better, push for more. And so there's, even if you are at one of these like quote unquote progressive universities, there's definitely always more you can be doing, and the work is never finished. And there's like some moderate liberals, right, who think they're all that, but I'm sure there's more we can do about, you know, diversity, inclusion, and equity. Lots of patting ourselves on the back. So I guess some of the things I want to mention is that as students, you have so much power, right? Because this university is technically, theoretically for you, right? Like you're paying the bills, you're paying the tuition. And so theoretically, your voice really matters. And I hope that is true. I say theoretically because, you know, there are variances everywhere, but like, I hope that is true. And so a lot of my advocacy, specifically in undergrad at NYU, was talking to the higher ups of the School of Social Work around some of our more like financial concerns, I guess, because again, we can't forget about capitalism, right? So we were fighting for Metro cards, like because students in New York City don't get free access to the subway system, and for some of us, like social workers, like myself, we were required to go all over the city for our jobs and for our different duties, and that was never paid for, right? And then this is specific to me, but I truly believe that that if you can angle yourself in a way, especially if you are LGBTQ or have more diverse identities, is that like they really, you know, they want to put you on the cover of all of their things, and so you better get something in return for that, right? And so I was able to angle myself and be like, hey, I have tapped out all of my family's resources to pay for college, which is it was a very true statement. There was a possibility I wasn't going to graduate my senior year, and I was like, either you give me more money or I don't come back. And they made some efforts and to make it work, and that's a singular story for me. But that's just to say that like you, especially as an LGBTQ or a person of a minority status, they really should value you, especially during this time, put their money where their mouth is, because you are ultimately paying their bills. And if they were to not let some really brilliant scholar graduate or succeed to their highest potential, that looks very poorly on them. So I'm not trying to say trick them, I'm not trying to say do that, but also just do what you need to do to get what you need out of the university, because they're for you.
Thank you, Alex. I want to bring in or give opportunities here for Brianna and Carolyn to add as well, just what the advocacy landscape looks like on your campus.
Oh, wait, do you want to go next, Carolyn? Or
Sure. So I guess my experience has been very different because BYU is a religious private institution. And so with advocacy and activism for LGBT students on our campus, there's a lot of fear surrounding it, because being an advocate and being an activist on the campus of BYU is very much against the norm. And there is a lot of fear surrounding being not only out, but being vocal and standing up for yourself. BYU has a very strict honor code that you have to sign to attend the university. And in that honor code, just identifying as queer was an honor code violation until 2007. And that was when USGA was actually, when that change happened was when USGA was formed, or shortly after that, actually. But even then, with that change, it still was prohibited to be like an advocate, to you know, promote homosexual behavior, to make statements that you thought it was morally acceptable. There is a lot of pushback for LGBTQ advocacy at BYU, and that can be seen even as recently as March, when BYU updated their honor code by removing the homosexuality clause that was in the honor code, that basically said that homosexual behavior was against the honor code and grounds for discipline. And that change got national attention. And you know, we were told as queer students at BYU that with the removal of that we would be treated equally as our straight peers are. And that, unfortunately, we were told that, and there was a period of about 2 weeks where we were told, and I was told multiple times, actually, over and over again, that queer students would now be, it wasn't encouraged, but they would no longer be disciplined for dating, kissing, holding hands, those kinds of things, which previously were grounds for discipline. And then about 2 weeks after they made that change, there was a letter sent out. And this was after the letter was sent out at a time where we had all just re-signed the honor code and just renewed our ecclesiastical endorsement that we have to be at the university. And then, I think it was the day before or the day of ecclesiastical endorsements being due, that they sent out a letter saying, actually, we're not going to add the homosexuality clause back in to the honor code, but you're still held to the same standard as when it was in the honor code. And so that we were told that with that letter, dating, kissing, holding hands, being in a relationship with someone of the same sex was again grounds for discipline. And so it's been really frustrating trying to advocate for changes at BYU, because there is a lot of pushback from not the whole student body, but some of the student body, and then the institution itself. So there's been a lot of pushback, and it's been really frustrating. And USGA is actually an unofficial group of BYU. We've, applied to be a official club of BYU many times, all the times that we could, and each time we've been given a no. And so we are currently an unofficial group of BYU, not sponsored by or endorsed by the university itself. So that's been kind of my experience with advocacy on the campus, and it's been really fear-invoking to even speak up as a queer minority student there, and also to speak up as a queer person of color as well. I'm Native American, and BYU doesn't, there's been some very unsettling racist comments that have happened at BYU recently, also with a panel that they did with the Black Student Union. So unfortunately, there's a lot of pushback, and there's a lot of fear that does surround advocacy here. But USGA is still, kind of tugging along, doing our best to not only advocate, but also to educate. We do classroom panels where professors of the university will invite us to their class to have kind of a panel like this with members from our leadership. We mostly visit sociology and psychology classes, but we've also done some panels in like women's studies courses and some education courses for future teachers, which is awesome. And so that's kind of what advocacy looks like at BYU right now for queer students there.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We are already also seeing just a spread. I mean, from what advocacy looks like, different from New York versus Utah. I think we have two different perspectives. Brianna, I want to give you the opportunity to weigh in here as well for CMU.
Yeah. Okay, well, actually, before I speak about CMU, I just want to say that I've had the pleasure of attending 3 different universities. CMU's my current university where I'm going for graduate school, but I had gotten my bachelor's degree from Binghamton University after first transferring from another 4-year university, which was Oswego State, which is in New York. So at Binghamton University, the way that advocacy was, I really liked the way that advocacy for the LGBTQ community was there, because the main LGBTQ club, I believe it was called Shades, they had pushed greatly for gender neutral bathrooms, and almost everywhere that there is, in every building, there's at least 1 or 2 gender neutral bathrooms. And I think that's very good progress, considering that a lot of schools don't have it. Like currently CMU, I haven't seen too many, I don't think I've seen any actually gender neutral bathrooms. So Binghamton, they did push for that. And also they pushed for a queer space, which was just a safe space for queer youth to go. And I really liked, like that had happened within me being there. They had pushed for a small space for the LGBTQ students to go, where they could study, where they could hang out, where they knew that they would be safe from any sort of harm or anything. And I feel like it would be great if CMU had that. I actually don't think that they have one right now, at least not the way that the one at my old school was set up, but that's how LGBTQ advocacy was at my old school. Now at CMU, I'm more involved within the Black Lives Matter groups, but within the Black community, one of the main Black organizations since we all kind of work together, we've mainly been promoting a lot of the different achievements and success stories of LGBT people throughout history. So within the, I'm in the Black Grad Student Organization, but within the Black student organization, which is called Spirit at CMU, we've just been promoting and pushing for spaces within the Black community, just like showing that we accept the LGBTQ youth within our community by just promoting them on our pages and promoting different people throughout history. So that's what it's looking like right now.
Wow, there's such, I mean, it's so interesting to hear from everybody, all the different experiences across all these different campuses. It seems everybody and this was part of our conversation that we've been having individually as well as last week with everyone, of just like the frontiers of advocacy look different campus to campus, and each campus is really at a different place. And so I think it's interesting to think of kind of where these movements are heading, and now with COVID-19 shifting all of this virtually. My next question really is just kind of like how have your student groups or that you've been a part of, how have you continued to be in contact with each other and still organized? I'm assuming there's a lot of Zoom calls as everything is now, but how has, and also like during the summer, have you guys been planning for returning to campus virtually in the fall, if you're in person, like what your student organization activities are going to look like?
So I would say that everything has really changed with COVID, and everything has really taken on a new angle through social media. All the activism that I've seen, whether it's Black Lives Matter, protests, things like that, all of these different things are being pushed through Instagram, through Facebook, through these different channels, and it becomes almost more accessible. You can almost find out what's happening even quicker now that we have these different channels. It's unfortunate that COVID happened, but I think it has given us an opportunity to kind of take stock of how we're doing our advocacy and how to make it even more accessible and even more widespread. And I think that that will continue to happen even as we move towards whatever our new normal may become, whether that's in person on campus or online again. I think that the impact that COVID has had and the impact that this new technological age where everything is online, I think that's really going to continue to shape advocacy. And I hope it makes everything a bit more accessible to people.
Okay. So I've been saying this over and over to everyone. COVID is like a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because we're all stuck indoors, but it's a blessing in the sense that it's creating new creative ways for people to interact and fight for what they believe is right. And I believe that the way that advocacy will change from now on is that we'll be able to reach more and more people because we will always have this medium of Zoom and other sorts of platforms such as social media, as Ravana just said, and everything else that people are now coming up with in order to allow us to make more connections. And these aren't just shallow connections in the sense that we're just typing everything out. Like right now, I've never, before COVID, I had barely ever done like video calls. I've never done a video panel until all of this. And I just feel very grateful that I'm able to speak to people who are across the state, across the country, and across even the world in some cases. But I do think that advocacy is going to change for the better after this because we will be able to just reach a broader audience in terms of everything.
Any other thoughts here on how COVID and the virtual moment has kind of shifted advocacy movements? And Alex, in your case, just how, if you wanted to elaborate a little more on telehealth as well, just what you think the prospects are for, or what universities could be doing to kind of address the needs of LGBTQ students in the fall.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree that everything's been said. I think even when/if, we handle COVID with a vaccine or whatever is to come, fingers crossed, I still think that like the effects of COVID will far outlast it in terms of our advocacy and how we connect with each other. I'm a big believer that in person is just will always be the best in terms of making those bonds, those connections, and really seeing someone. There is like a weird disconnect when you're speaking over digital devices. So I have like mixed feelings about let's say telehealth type therapy, right? On one hand, it's super convenient. You don't have to put pants on to like go see your therapist. But at the same time, there's like this difference, versus sitting in that room with a real life person. So I think we're still figuring all that out. What that means for advocacy and for, I agree that everything has been said. I also just want to say that like, I'm super excited for the future of digital advocacy. And I also don't think that like Facebook and Instagram often have advocates' best interests at heart, right? From like a political standpoint, Facebook and Instagram have been censoring queer voices, Black voices for a long time. And so I am excited for the future of what's to come, while also knowing that I'm searching for other opportunities and options than just those two traditional platforms. I get lots of my like most up-to-date information from Twitter. I think that's another one that's underutilized in many regards. I know Reddit recently just banned a whole bunch of Trump, I'm not sure, I don't use Reddit, but like Trump threads. So that, because while there's the flip side to every coin, right? Like while there's all this great stuff happening, all this other misinformation is also going out there that is butting heads with the exact causes that we're rallying for. So I think we're having to hold those two truths at once while we are utilizing social media in this brand new way. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've set up Gary here to come in as well. Gary, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot in preparation for the conversation today has been about kind of the history behind these movements and you know, what that has looked like and how, you know, the different causes that we've been rallying for have kind of shifted. Do you have any further kind of analysis that you would offer here, Gary? Where, like, I'm thinking also just like in terms of, you know, PEN America does a lot of work, Alex, you know, when you were bringing up social media and censorship, and this is one of the spaces, you know, PEN America is really, you know, active in. And so it just makes me think of the current moment, like the current political moment, the upcoming election, you know, things that are on the minds of queer people and queer students in terms of advocacy, you know, getting onto the platforms, you know, potentially, you know, post, you know, post Trump or post continuation of Trump, like what, you know, what the causes we're going to be fighting for will look like. Gary, did you want to weigh in here on kind of that development and where you see kind of the future of queer advocacy headed?
Yeah, if I could piggyback on what Brianna said with respect to, you know, this being both a blessing and a curse, I think the timing of this pandemic and the timing of, frankly, the most recent Supreme Court decision in which basically the goal of INDA during like the 2006 basically rise of Nancy Pelosi as Democratic House Speaker, and then in 2008, or rather 2009, with Obama's election, all these new efforts or rather new opportunities to bring forth change for the queer community. The latest Supreme Court decision, I think, helped realize the goal of INDA, which is to basically stop or at least begin tapping back on discrimination in the workplace. When there were first these opportunities to make progress with new leadership in Congress and the White House, there were four pretty major priorities: Don't Ask, Don't Tell, gay marriage, of course, INDA, which would come at the very end, even though it had the greatest and broadest impact on everyone, since most of us have to work. Not everyone wants to join the military or get married, but everyone has to work. And then, of course, the last, not the last achievement, but hate crimes legislation. Well, all four of these priorities have now been realized with the latest Supreme Court ruling. So with the pandemic being where we are, this gives, I think, a lot of advocates and activists a really wonderful opportunity to connect and really work on where the frontiers are and where and how to move them. So whether you're talking about moving the needle with respect to religious communities or religious institutions, frankly, whether it's maybe more evangelical institutions. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of the school. It's in Virginia, Caldwell maybe? I can't remember, I'm sorry. Or BYU, or a number of Catholic institutions. Or whether it's trying to connect these different wings, if you will, of the LGBTQIA, the queer community together. So we're fighting more on each other's behalf, even if they don't impact us directly. This does present, I think, a very unique moment for us all to connect. With the rise of the internet generally, that allowed a number of communities, some good actors, some bad actors, to connect all over the country and all over the world broadly. This is really forcing, I think, potentially really good actors to connect together. And I think it presents for us a really good opportunity to kind of scope out and pave the way for the new challenges that await us all.
And I'm curious if Ray perhaps could add here, just along the kind of the lines of thinking about the future of queer advocacy, queer student advocacy. Ray, in prior conversations, we talked about the kind of like how the culture around advocacy, queer advocacy, has shifted from being kind of white cis dominated to being more inclusive of, or kind of passing the torch to queer communities of color. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of that transition and what you feel like is happening there?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I also want to bring to light that Pride started with these Black trans women and the roots of the queer community. I think we need to take note of where our roots are from and kind of how we have all of these resources. The fights for marriage and joining the army and things like that, like you were talking about, Gary, we're kind of switching to this intersection of what about queer people of color? What are the different experiences of undocumented queer people? So sort of this shift away from marriage equality and these things that sort of affect more, or well, they affect everyone, but bringing in a more diverse array of voices is something that I see really happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. I talked about this with you last time, how LA Pride, there was a huge pushback because they were moving it to a Black Lives Matter protest. However, they were still involving police. And so a lot of people were thinking that they had the right intentions, but they had the wrong sort of leadership, as no one had brought up in their leadership that bringing the police in could have a disproportionate effect on people of color. So what actually ended up happening is the original LA Pride organizers gave the whole protest to Black Lives Matter organizers to kind of take over. So I think this sort of passing the torch and also sort of uplifting voices is something really important. So sort of passing the mic and not speaking for other people, I think is something that we're seeing happening in the community, even if they do have a couple falls here and there, like LA Pride. And I'm hoping that we continue to see this as a trend of kind of helping uplift more voices.
And Carolyn, if I could bring you in here as well to just what does the future of queer advocacy look like in Utah? And does it look differently from other parts of the country, and what queer advocacy movements are kind of going towards and working towards?
Yeah, so with like the honor code changes in March, and then the reversal of that, USGA has been kind of inactive since then, just because we went online shortly after the reversal happened, and I think many people in the queer community here were just completely shocked, and it felt it felt kind of like we finally had the chance to breathe, and then they just cut our oxygen off. And so I think a lot of queer people here in Utah, especially those attending BYU who are directly affected by this, are like just getting to the point where we have processed enough what actually happened to like start being active again. I know that as USGA, we're gonna do our best to like be back online in the fall, potentially meeting in person, depending on what the situation with COVID looks like at that point. But I think with queer advocacy in Utah, it's really, I think it has been in the past and will continue to be baby steps, just because there is so much pushback from the majority of the religious community here in Utah. So I think just baby steps with that, and our advocacy is going to look very different than other parts of the country. We're getting to the point now where we're just being able to talk about race issues here at BYU, following the racist comments that occurred in the Black Student Union panel that they had. There was a lot of pushback and a lot of uproar with that. as there should have been. And, you know, with the Black Lives Matter protests going on and stuff, BYU, I think this is a really positive change that they just implemented. So they just put together a committee to look at racial inequality here at BYU. And so that's a really positive change. But, you know, we're just getting to the point where we're dealing with racial issues here. And so queer issues, I think, often kind of are taking a back seat just because there is much less diversity at BYU than at maybe a lot of other universities. I think more than people might think, but still, we are a minority here. And so I think with queer advocacy, I think it's very intertwined with racial advocacy here, because the same people that are fighting for racial equality here are oftentimes the same people fighting for queer equality. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of the time it is queer people of color who are doing all of the grunt work and all of that emotional labor to, you know, have that advocacy, because, you know, there is the tendency to not be an advocate or not be an activist because it's just comfortable. It's more comfortable to not. And I think that's sometimes where people are. And I think especially with BYU students in particular, because the honor code exists and because advocacy is very much frowned upon, especially with LGBTQ issues, it's really scary for even allies to speak up, because they themselves could face discipline for speaking out against church leaders or speaking out against the institution of BYU itself. And so I think that there's a lot of fear surrounding it. And so I think that here in Utah, it will be very baby steps and, you know, one step at a time, and let's, you know, kind of handle one issue at a time. But there are a lot of good people here who are doing a lot of work to promote equality in this area, which I am really thankful for. So.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Brianna, were you going to add something here?
Well, actually, I've been getting questions in the question and answer thing. I wanted to know if you guys could do that too, or
Yes.
can I
Did
just...
you want to take any of them?
Oh yeah, there's one that's actually for all of us technically. It says, there's been a lot of national attention to the issue of free speech on college campuses. How did the panelists see that issue? Also, Alex mentioned censorship of queer voices online. Is that an issue that he or others have experienced on campus? Okay. So, I mean, I think free speech is very important. Free speech it's a touchy topic, because there's different types of free speech. There's free speech that is intended to hurt others, and there's free speech that is kind of just you voicing your ideas. I do think that everybody does have the right to say what they want to say, but they need to understand that sometimes there are consequences for what you say and what actions you take in regards to it. I don't believe that hate speech should be tolerated in any way, but unfortunately, since hate speech is seen differently depending on who you are, it's very difficult. It's a very difficult topic to deal with. So I haven't seen anything on the censorship of queer voices online. I think the other panelists might be able to speak on that better, but somebody actually did make a comment to me regarding CMU, how I did say that at my old school there were gender neutral bathrooms, but they said that there is a queer advocacy group that is pushing for gender neutral bathrooms here at CMU. So from my perspective right now, it doesn't seem as though they're being silenced or as though queer voices are being pushed under the ground at CMU. But Gary, do you think you'd be able to speak a little bit more on that, if possible?
I don't know that I could speak to really CMU. So this coming fall, I'll be a third-year PhD student. But I think I can speak to more of the general trend. So, like, just very brief aside, my alma mater again was UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and in the 90s, our wonderful Senator in North Carolina, Jesse Helms, in an effort to prevent the state from going forward with making a state zoo, so just put a fence around Chapel Hill, because I guess that's how liberal he considered all of us to be. UNC Chapel Hill has attracted a lot of attention, generally from, I would say, bad actors with political agendas as it pertains to political speech. And I would say that, of course, I support free speech. I don't know if that's ever really been the issue. It seems like an idea that's been co-opted and misinterpreted. So, for example, it was entirely all too common to, as you're going across the quad on campus, to be met by pit preachers, to be met with people who are holding up giant posters of aborted fetuses, all of this with like a particular religious or political import, and all that was entirely legal, all that was entirely within the right of those individuals to do it. But there does, I think, call for a line to be made between free speech and being given, a platform, particularly through the capacity of a university. So, for example, the right of, say, Ben Shapiro, for example, to receive $40,000 to speak in a facility that we as students pay for, especially considering how much states have cut back on funding to public schools and how much the federal government has cut back from public schools. We're paying $40,000 or sometimes even more a year. We certainly as students should have a say as to who's going to be using the facilities that we're paying for. Whereas if they just wanted to come to campus and speak on the pit like any other person, they'd have every right and license to do that. So this is more me just trying to push back against the idea that there's really a concerted attack against free speech. I think this is more of a political ploy. I do think we should all be somewhat sensitive to what's actually being attacked. Another example would be, you mentioned yourself with respect to, freedom of speech as differentiated, say, from freedom from consequences. If you run into a crowded campus, a quad, and yell, any number of slurs, you shouldn't expect that people won't have anything to say back to you, right? Because if you have freedom of speech, so does everyone else. And the idea that you should have freedom of speech without freedom of consequences, those two things don't necessarily comport with one another. So I would just encourage all of us to be very sensitive and critical of these kinds of debates, because I think they're often co-opted by bad actors, or insincere ones at the least.
I have to butt in here just in the interest of time. I think, Ray, you might, I think indicated in the Q&A, you may have an answer as well for this. And Alex, you may want to weigh in on that censorship question. I just want to give everyone kind of a final, tee up a final roundtable question for everyone to answer. And that's just the main takeaway that people should be walking away from this with. And that's, I think, for a university administrator that's watching this conversation today, for a faculty member that's watching this conversation today, or to a fellow student, that's on a campus that's watching this today, what is the message that you have for them, essentially, for the viewers? What is the main takeaway you would like for them to know? And we'll start with anyone who wants to answer this, and then I'll make sure we hit everybody.
Well, I'll just, to wrap up the censorship portion. I guess for me, I was speaking more so about social media censorship, which could be completely separate from, college life. But like, as we are moving towards a more online platform, I think that's something we have to consider more often. I just know that when creating, let's say, Facebook events, right? There's a very specific language that you can or can't use, and then your event may not be approved, or the images you use may not be approved, and it will change the demographic of who sees what you're posting. So there's just all these different algorithms that do censor things online, both on Instagram and on Facebook, that I think we have to become more familiar with. So that's it. I totally agree with what Gary and everyone has been saying, but yeah, this is just the digital element of that. And then in terms of takeaways, I think like this panel has obviously shown that there's a variety of things happening on college campuses, and we're all at different stages. I would say collaboration, in the sense that I was reflecting when Carolyn was speaking about how the LGBTQ group and the Black Student Caucus, they both had their different missions, or things that they're working towards. But I also think that there's a lot of intersection between those. And I think we're much more powerful when we can find some agreement. Obviously, we have some very specific different issues, but we know that there are people who do live in that intersection. And so imagine if both parties were to demand the same thing from a school, how powerful that would be to have those united voices, because so often we silo and segregate ourselves in that way. And so that's not to say we don't have specific things for LGBTQ and specific things for the Black Student Caucus, but I'm sure there's also things that we could collaborate on, and that would be very, very powerful. And I don't think that any university would have much of a choice but to listen to us if we were in more of a unison and more of a sync. So that's my takeaway.
I feel like a takeaway that I would want for school administration to have would be that they need to listen and act. So they need to listen to what it is that the student body wants, what it is that these minority groups desire, what they need, and they actually need to act and make a plan on it and like show how they're going to implement it. Because within the other schools that I've been at, like I've mainly been paying attention to the racial things, because that's just, I feel like racially, that's just what always impacted me the most, because it's my community. But I think that I've always seen this cycle of a little incident would occur on campus, a racially charged incident would occur on campus. All the student groups would come together, they'd like address the administration. Administration would like put out a half-hearted apology and then do nothing. And then it would happen again. And it's just a cycle that continuously repeats. And I think that all minority groups need to get their administration to not just do these little I can't think of any better word than half-assed responses to these racially or even sexually charged incidences than to just send out letters. They need to actually do something. So they need to provide full transparency on what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, in addition to a timeline. And that's what I would want everybody to take away from this. I want them to push for their administrations at their schools to actually do something about what the desires of these minority groups are.
If I might, I think I would throw in, after what Brianna said, and just say beware of risk management, because we're adults and we're either being college educated or we already are college educated. We know what that looks like. So beware of risk management, because if your efforts are perceived rightly as insincere, that's only going to compound whatever problems that you may genuinely be sincere about fighting. So beware about risk management. We're not risks to be managed. We're your communities.
So I would have to say, kind of going back to the lip service that a lot of universities do, I think that universities need to take a look at what their professorship looks like and if that reflects their student body. Do we have Black professors? Do we have brown professors? Do we have professors of trans identity and LGBTQ and things like that? I think the people that are given power are the ones who are making these decisions. And if if your school is not putting this into mind, they can be perpetuating all of these harmful sort of isms and things like that that are happening in the community. So I think looking to who has power right now, who they're hiring, who's on your board, who's getting tenured, things like that, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I would add, I completely agree with what's been said. And I think another thing, I think it's important for administrations to recognize inequality on the campuses and recognize who doesn't have access to free speech, to free expression, to other freedoms that we should all be guaranteed. I would think that, I would also hope that administrations, obviously we have freedom of religion and I completely support that. But I think that religion is often weaponized to use against minority groups. And I think that in those cases when it is weaponized, I think it's important for administration to make a statement that that's not okay and that, freedom of religion should not be, weaponized to discriminate against LGBTQ, Black and Brown communities, and other minority groups that exist on college campuses that unfortunately may not have the same access to all the freedoms that a lot of people just kind of take for granted.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, and everyone. And as we bring this panel to a close, I just want to, again, just thanking everyone and recognizing everyone's bravery during this time and the bravery and the advocacy and facing different, challenges, our various identities, our various communities, geographies, campuses, families, environments. These are all, I think, part of I think we said in one of our conversations, queer people are no strangers to quarantine and the effects that has on self-expression. And PEN America as a free expression organization that's dually committed to protecting and safeguarding free expression while also working to dispel all hatreds, including racism, homophobia, transphobia. I hope that everyone on this call and everyone viewing will continue to consider PEN America as a friend and an ally in these efforts. And so we hope to plan more conversations on inclusive free speech in the near future for campus communities. And I hope that this conversation also serves as kind of a blossoming of community itself among queer students in the free expression advocacy space. And so I'm hoping to have more conversations in the future. I think towards the end here, we were talking about just free speech and student activism on campus. And I think that's really one of the central focuses of our work. And I think more conversations on this are definitely needed in the future. And so for those watching, if you are interested in, if you found this conversation fascinating, which I certainly did, and if you agree with me in believing that there's so much more that needs to be done and would like to hear more from these panelists and other activists, students, faculty, administrators in the university realm that are promoting free expression and navigating in various different ways, you can stay tuned to or tune into PEN America's activities by following us on social media, subscribing to our emails, and also consider becoming a member of PEN America if you have not already joined already. And for our latest advice on campus free speech issues, we also encourage everyone to access our campus free speech guide at campusfreespeechguide.pen.org. And so thank you again, everyone, to our panelists and our live audience, and have a wonderful evening. And in solidarity, PEN America is with you and hopes that we will get through these very difficult challenges together.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. It was a pleasure speaking to everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Everyone, it's a wonderful pleasure.
Thank you.